Welcome to The Other Coast, a podcast dedicated to the Malifaux meta in Los Angeles. My name is Jeff, and with me here today are two other players in the SoCal area, Jim and Colgan.
Hey guys, how's it going?
Hey everyone.
Hey, great. So, today the original plan was to have an episode where we kind of talked about models and evaluated why they were good and why they were bad. But, so much of it relies on context, and the more we thought about it, the more it seemed like we were going to have kind of an aimless 30-hour episode that said it depends. So to, I guess, kind of avoid that and make something listenable, we figured what we would do instead is we would generate a scenario and then go through the process that we use individually to determine, what master and what sort of models we might bring to this game. And, this isn't like top podium talk. We're not saying you should do what we do because we're great players. But we just wanted to kind of introduce our process, and maybe you would think it's interesting. Maybe you would think it's laughable. But at the very least, we hope it might be entertaining.
Absolutely. I would just want to cut in here real quick and say that there's a lot of talk online about why models are good and why models are bad. At the time of this recording, Weird has been showing off the new Explorer Society models, and this has sparked a huge discussion about this model is busted or this model is bad.
Winston.
Yes, Winston. That's all armchair theory foe, and yeah, we're trying to be less theory foe and more what our process is.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think that's a good point. A lot of this is contextual. Malifaux, I don't think you can math hammer Malifaux. And other people have said this too, right? I don't think you can do it to the same degree. That being said, Winston is objectively broken. I'm sorry.
I'm not, because I am going to play him.
Yeah. So, that is a good caveat, though. And Jim is totally right. Here's the scenario. We have a corner deployment. The strategy is symbols of authority. And then the scheme pool is sabotage, spread them out, research mission, breakthrough, and catch and release. And so if any of you want to maybe pause the recording and sort of look over what those strategy and schemes entail, that's great. And if you have them all memorized, you should probably be doing this recording instead of us.
Just a little bit.
We're just going to go on. So, Colgan, you see corner deployment. Does that suggest anything to you?
So the corner in combination with symbols of authority, to me it speaks that you're going to need a lot of mobility. Personally, I feel out of like the 4 deployments, like corner is the one that kind of limits your movement the most. Mm-hmm. Like you're kind of wanting to spread all your guys and like getting as far as possible since you want to get into the enemy's line, but it kind of ends up with you guys being clumped and maybe running into each other, and then you also have the issue with trying to navigate the terrain depending on where you are. So yeah, I would probably be looking for a more mobile crew, maybe something that can ignore terrain, especially because with a strategy like Symbols of Authority, you need to be trying to get off interacts to actually pick up the enemy tokens.
So, Jim, corner is, I haven't done the geometry, so I'm not sure if this is actually accurate, but I believe corner deployment is the smallest area of all the deployment choices. And so...
I think you're right.
Right. And so then you would have the largest amount of remaining area in which to place the Symbols of Authority. Is that, is that at all anything worth considering?
Oh, 100%. I like to look at the pool in its entirety when looking at the deployment, because with symbols, symbol markers can go anywhere in your board half, and they have to be 8 inches away from each other, so they're by nature going to be spread out. When you only have a 12-inch quarter bubble from your corner that the corner deployment gives you, you really can make it hard for your opponent to get their models to the markers. Another thing is that you have a very small deployment zone, and so does your opponent. I take a quick look at the scheme pool and I see, oh my gosh, how many scheme marker schemes in this pool need to be near the enemy deployment zone or in the enemy deployment zone. If I need to send a scheme runner all the way into that last little 12-inch semi-bubble in the corner for breakthrough, that's going to take a lot more mobility. And like Colgan was saying, you're already looking at mobility, so it's telling me that this pool really wants me to bring a crew that is fast. And it also tells me I probably don't want to take a crew that's melee based, because there are crews in the game that have an abundance of melee actions and maybe a dearth of gun actions. I'm looking at you, Ulix, and the pigs. If you have to spend an entire turn just moving up, that's a turn you've lost getting effective actions out of your models.
Yeah, I mean, that makes sense. So, then Colgan, looking at the pool and looking at the deployment, what might be some of the masters that you play that you would be interested in bringing into this scenario?
To me, it's a pretty scheme-heavy pool. You got research missions, spread them out, sabotage, breakthrough, all schemes that you're trying to drop down scheme markers. So I would be looking maybe for something with like Don't Mind Me or just a lot of mobility. So out of the crews I play, I would might lean into Mei Fang for this one. Like once you kind of get your network set up, you can kind of threaten several different symbols at the same time. The scrap markers are going to help a lot with scoring research mission. And then if you have like rail workers around, if you're trying to clear a strategy so you can get an interact off, you can just like run up and toss whatever model happens to be trying to prevent your interact action.
Right.
In addition, her crew tends to be fairly tanky, like lots of armored models, hard to kill is pretty easy to get on certain minions, which is strong into catch and release. After playing with catch and release a bit in some of the games I've been playing, I'm starting to really like it because it's not a super easy scheme to deny. And in a lot of cases, if you have a tar pit unit, you're already going to want to tie up either their henchman or their master to kind of reduce their actions and to like get some of their action efficiency drained. And the opponent generally doesn't want to just like throw more units at the problem while you're running around the board scoring points somewhere else.
Right. Now, we have mentioned previously on the podcast that you are also a Nelly player, or that you have several games experience with Nelly. So what about this pool says to you Mei Fang instead of Nelly?
Well, I guess if you ran Nelly into this, it would be a little bit more denial for the schemes that they're running. Mm-hmm. But I feel like in general, Nelly doesn't have as much mobility as a lot of other crews have. Like a lot of her powers at denial. Mm-hmm. So you would be able to heavily deny in as far as a defensive thing, but it might be difficult to actually like reach and interact with a lot of the strategy markers, since oddly enough, I think Nelly is really the only one in her keyword with Don't Mind Me.
So if the deployment had been maybe flank or wedge, Nelly might be more interesting as a choice, but in corner deployment, you feel that Mei Fang's movement tricks give her, the edge for how you want to play it.
Yeah, I think, like going to symbols of authority, I want to be able to threaten multiple strategy markers at once, because, if you're focusing all of your guys in one place, then the opponent doesn't need to commit as many guys. If they can just tie up your guys in melee and force you to take disengage actions, then they know those models are no longer able to actually pick up those strategy markers.
Right. Yeah, that makes sense. So Jim, same question. You're looking at this pool of the masters that you play. What are you thinking about bringing?
So I actually look at this pool and it screams Zip to me. For a lot of the reasons that Colgan said for Foundry. So, Zip's entire keyword has a lot of models with greater than average movement, the ability to move the models that don't have greater than average movement with Fly With Me. They drop piano markers because of course they do. And Research Mission is one of those schemes that is very binary. And when I say binary, I mean it is either on the table or it is not likely on the table. And when you go into a game, if your opponent can say there is a very low chance they took that scheme because they don't have the tools to achieve it, it makes it easier for them to deny you, because they can just say, all right, I only have to look for the tells for the 4 schemes that are more likely than not to be taken.
Mm-hmm.
So a model So again, research mission, for those of you who haven't memorized it like me, you have to have 3 different types of markers on the enemy table half. Now you can always make scheme. Strategy markers are a viable marker type, and this mission you drop strategy markers in both table sides, and when you die, you drop either corpse or scrap most of the time. Those are the 3 you normally get, and it's really hard to get a corpse where you want it, especially next to a strategy marker that you don't want to also tear down. Here comes Zip. Boom, I can drop a piano. I get that extra 3rd marker I can place where I want to. So I may not even take research mission, but having that option in my kit makes that keyword more viable for me. Right. I look at these, and yeah, you're Colgan, you're right. This pool has scheme and interact requirements out the wazoo. There's really no points to be generated by killing, but killing can be good at denying your opponent from scoring, and Zip can do that pretty well. So I feel like I can take a crew into this pool that has the blend of mobility, interact, and offensive threat that I want when I see this pool.
Yeah, it makes sense. And Zip has a lot of mobility, so the corner deployment is, was that a motivating factor at all for the selection?
100%.
If it had been a more open deployment, what other master do you think you might have considered?
I think I would have considered possibly Wong or Ulix in this. I find that Wong's ability to drop markers in far parts of the board is one of his better strengths. So he has this ability, launch into space, where he targets a marker and he removes it from the board, and next turn he drops it down anywhere he can see. And he has a trigger to drop a second copy of that marker. Well, I see Sabotage, which requires 2 markers in a spot, Spread Them Out, which requires multiple markers in different spots, and I see Breakthrough, which requires a scheme marker in a part of the opponent's deployment zone that might be hard to get to. All of those things Wong can do by himself. And his keyword is otherwise very fast. They die easy, but without the incentive to kill, my opponent may not take a punchy crew. And then I can kind of not be punished by having such a squishy crew and make up for it with a lot of speed that Wong has. Ulix, same thing. His crew is very fast but squishy. And when you kill his pigs, they drop scheme markers. So he kind of can still score even if he's being tabled.
Yeah, I like it. I could definitely see that working. But yeah, with this sort of penned-in deployment, I do think Zip makes a lot of sense there. For me, well, if Explorer Society were legal, I think I would declare Winston as my leader in this pool and then just win. Because I really don't see how you would beat him. But among the choices that are available to me, right now, to me, this really screams Colette. And I think it would, I think if a Colette player could choose a pool, this might be pretty close to the one that they would make. Mm-hmm. Just because, Colette, and her crew, they have all the Don't Mind Me. They interact with scheme markers quite well. Colette herself has incredible movement. There's several schemes are appealing to several of her models. The Duet, which is an incredible model, would be great for catch and release. The Duet is also a very effective scheme runner. It can seem, I guess, kind of silly maybe to use that many stones as a scheme runner, but because of all the activations you can get from it, and because it is so dangerous, that the enemy player will often either try to avoid it or dedicate a very serious model to it, which the Duet might even be able to defeat. So yeah, I think I would probably bring Colette into this, and I don't actually, in contrast to maybe the route you guys took, I actually think I would take Colette in any of these deployments, just because, again, her movement tricks are appealing, but even if the deployment were more open, I don't think another master would gain enough to make it worth it for me to take them over Colette.
So then, out of your kind of master pool, there's no one else you'd really consider for this pool?
I think, if I didn't want to bring Colette, or if I forgot my Colette models, which since what I bring to I'm not Jim, I don't bring 300 models to every game, so I'm
I feel like you're shaming people now.
It's only 3 very large cases.
I mean, and to kind of fire back, is the reason you want to bring Colette because she's the only crew that you have painted?
They do play better.
Yeah. Well, that's true. And also, I'm going to place all my scheme markers in this shed that I have mostly painted. No, if I didn't play Colette, of the masters that I play, maybe Molly would be appealing for the denial element. Because you can assume that there's going to be a lot of markers coming down. And so, Molly's going to be able to convert those into cards and deny victory points. So I think that could be quite appealing. And also Molly's crew has a good deal of mobility. And I've been playing a lot of Rezzers lately, so if I were to declare Rezzer, I would probably pick Molly out of this.
And that's a fair point. Like, we did skip that the first step is you do announce your faction with your opponent. Realistically, when you're rocking up to a table at your local store, you're probably you generate your scheme pool before you pick your faction. And unless it's an organized event or you're trying to practice a particular faction or master, most people aren't going to be like, I only ever do this, unless that's all they have. So we're coming at this from kind of that we are doing a master because the faction is kind of like tied into that. If your opponent picks a faction that you're like not sure about with this particular master, yeah, that's going to be a factor in your decision making. But for purposes of this analysis, I think it's fair to say that we're not really worrying too much about what our opponent might be bringing.
Right. No, that's true. And also, I don't know necessarily if this is true across the board, but in our meta, there are a lot of people who maybe just bring one list. Maybe they even only have one master. And maybe even only one set list. They don't have even necessarily a lot of versatile or out of keyword choices. There are people who decide what they want to bring before coming to the game store, and they want to play this master and this list. And there's nothing wrong with that. I do it from time to time, and then I look and see what scenario I have to play in, and I regret it. But Colgan, let's say, for instance, because I know you have Bass and you play him from time to time. Let's say, for instance, you had just decided that you were going to play Bass today at the game store, and not really worry about what the scenario was, and then you have this pool in front of you. So this is not Bass wasn't one of your top choices for this, but what would you do in that situation? What sort of adjustments could you make?
So I think this is when you need to think kind of about the strength of your keywords. So one benefit that Bass does have going for him is he has, what is it? Home on the Frontier?
Home on the Range.
Home on the Range, that's what it is. So you're able to actually deploy very aggressively into this. So what I might actually look at is, instead of trying to score as many points as I can, is I might look for more sort of a denial game. Deploying that far up, I can kind of set up a gun line, and I can have a good way of controlling my enemy's movement. You can take some hunting traps, or just spawn some with like pathfinders you bring into the game to slow down your enemy, and just make it very action inefficient for them to try and get to the symbols on your side of the board. If I'm thinking about kind of playing to put pressure on the opponent, maybe I'm not going to focus so much on really diving into their backline, because the Frontiers crew isn't the tankiest of crews.
Mm-hmm.
So I might be looking at, I'd be looking at schemes that I feel like I can reliably score without having to go too far into the backline. So I might look at, catch and release is nice because I already want to tie people up. So, maybe at the end of the game, or at the end of a turn, I'll just like sneak in into engage with like follow my path or something like that.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
I almost might look at research mission. This is a little bit more difficult because even though Bass can generate the dust cloud markers, because they disappear before you actually go to scoring, they won't actually help you out for this. But if you have enough traps and your enemy has no choice but to kill them, you're generating scrap on their side of the board.
So you had mentioned that when you were looking at what you would want to play in this pool, you said that this isn't really a very fighty pool. If you play Bass as part of your denial strategy, kill, like, are you much more aggro as Bass, or is that maybe a deceptive belief that might not be true?
So as per the famous phrase, it's always going to be, it depends. As we were talking about, all of us, we wanted to take kind of more of these schemier crews with like lots of fast movement, not necessarily very punchy. So, with that kind of like ranged gun line setup and being able to deploy very aggressively, I'd be looking at trying to pick off, models of like Don't Mind Me or like Leap, or are able to kind of get around these screens that I'm trying to set up.
Mm-hmm.
So, I mean, like no matter which crew you're playing, like if you can eliminate an enemy model, that's like the most surefire way to make sure they can't score a point with them.
Mm-hmm. Unless it's hidden martyrs. Which isn't in the pool. Martyrs. So you're good.
But yeah, I'd be focusing mainly more on just kind of a denial game. And as part of denial, like, yeah, you're going to try and pick off units, or at least like weaken them enough that your opponent doesn't feel comfortable making more aggressive moves with them.
Right.
Now here's a question for you guys. How do you feel about picking schemes and only planning to score 1 point on that scheme?
I think if I've scored 1 point on a scheme, I'm doing pretty well.
I mean, the reason I ask is, like taking the Talking Bass's crew, your entire crew is like right up on that center line turn 1 because of home on the range. I could see you getting a single point out to spread them out pretty easy early, and then if you get a second point, great. If not, hey, you're up a point, and that didn't require you to commit to the scheme marker shenanigans that the other ones do.
In tournament play, where your margin of victory matters for placement, I think it's more tempting maybe to try to score points. But in a casual game, or in a game where margin of victory doesn't matter, you're just trying to win, I actually think denial may be the more reliable form of victory. You try to get an early lead, and then make it mostly about gumming up the works, because I think Malifaux lends itself very well to disruptive style play.
Mm-hmm.
So I would actually be comfortable scoring just 1 point with both my schemes if I felt I could deny the same from the other side.
Yeah, I think that's something else to consider. Maybe it's not the most sportsmanlike, but there's also kind of like the psychological factor to it. If you're able to take two schemes that like you're not sure if you can score the end condition, but you're like positive that you're be able to like score the reveal very easily and quickly, like starting off a game really strong and just having a huge lead over your opponent, it gives you a lot of leeway in choices you make after that. You can choose to forego like making the riskier actions to score more points for yourself, just to delay them or deny any schemes or strategies that they're trying to score.
So now, Jim, in a pool like this where you have just so many different schemes that kind of have the same or similar scoring mechanisms, namely scheme markers, when you're playing, how are you going to be trying to figure out, what the opponent is doing? I mean, if they're making it easier for you and trying to measure out if the markers are 10 inches from each other, for spread them out, I mean, that's one thing. But, assuming that they're being a little bit more careful with masking their play, would you even consider trying to do actions that would maybe give you specific information that might solve what they're doing?
That's a good question. My immediate reaction is looking at these schemes, right? Sabotage requires it to be next to a piece of terrain. If I look at their crew and I see they have mobile scheme runners, like I'm trying to run, what kind of scheme runners are they? There are models that have this ability called False Claim that can drop multiple scheme markers in a specific area. Sabotage requires multiple scheme markers in a specific area. That would be, to me, something that says maybe they're going for that scheme. If they have Leap, or the ability to drop 2 scheme markers in an activation, I might expect Breakthrough. If they just have really fast models and they're probably only going to drop, they don't have like drop additional marker shenanigans, that might be sabotage. You know, I kind of look at what their models have as far as their actions and their abilities, and like what could that model do in one activation.
Got it.
And that tells me what they're probably going to do with that activation.
Yeah, I mean, sounds reasonable. So, this pool comes up, and Jim, you've declared Zip and Colgan. Colgan's declared Mayfang. Colgan, what are some models that you might be looking to bring into your Mayfang crew with this pool?
So I mentioned before, the rail workers I think would be nice, just having that armor 1 and hard to kill and being fairly low cost minions. It kind of opens up a lot of potential schemes that you can threaten. And I know we talked about this earlier, but going into a game and being able to reliably score or select a couple of schemes is a big advantage, because after you see the opponent's crew and exactly what models they're bringing, you can kind of adjust your strategy based on what you think will be the easiest to avoid. So for me, like the rail workers, like they make great candidates for catch and release because they're tanky, and like it doesn't really seem suspicious to just use them to kind of screen or tar pit an enemy model. They can also be useful for helping you secure strategy points by just tossing off like an annoying enemy model that's trying to prevent you from interacting with scheme or strategy markers near him by threading with like a 2-inch melee range or something like that.
Are you bringing any beaters?
So just in general, I always like to bring at least one beater because I figure there's going to be something you need to kill. And, especially with Mei Fang's team, because I want to try and get that scrap network up so I can start rail walking and forcing my opponent to try and defend multiple points. I would probably bring a metal golem. Can march him. He can threat a lot of things as well, or just kind of kill any squishy scheme runners that happen to get too close to him.
Makes sense. So I want to ask you about, whether you would maybe include any out-of-keyword or versatile models, but before I can do that, we have to clarify whether or not you'd be bringing Mayfang, Ten Thunders, or Arcanist, because she is a dual-faction master.
Yeah, recently when I've been playing her, I've been running her as Arcanist. I just love having Arcane Reservoir.
Right.
Just like getting that extra card, being able to kind of better plan out your turn, I think is always really helpful. A lot of the models in our crew have like pretty good tactical actions to try and like build out that network faster.
Sure.
So yeah, like you might also take some survivors who can kind of chuck some scrap markers at range.
I mean, to be fair, as a Bayou player, I have to say survivors have a ridiculously solid ranged attack for their cost. And when you have corner deployment, being able to reach out and touch someone 14 inches away, that's not too bad.
Oh yeah, for sure. And they're pretty survivable, which I mean makes sense.
It's in the name.
Yeah. So Jim, who's coming down the airship with Zip?
I was doing a little crew building in the app here, and it's looking an awful lot like an enforcer party. So first off, a lot of the models in Zip's keyword have this ability to eat a scheme marker called free loot, and that helps with the denial aspect, and it's something I didn't bring up earlier. But you have the first mate, because the first mate is a leaper. He's got stealth, so if I need someone to go into my opponent's side, he's a great piece. He can fight for himself, and he has a lot of ways to eat scheme markers at range. He has the menacing croak which has a trigger that can just remove a scheme marker within 3. So he doesn't even have to be in base contact and take the interact action to remove markers. I would probably take Maris Lacroix. She is a cross keyword with the kin. She flies. She has bombs away, which is really her big thing, because she can drop a scheme marker at 5 inches away with a tome trigger on her bonus action. So if I need to drop a scheme marker outside of an interact action within 2 inches, like for sabotage, she can do that for a 5 of tomes, which is not a significant investment. And I'm probably bringing some Bayou Smugglers. These guys have been really blessed by their errata. They can eat scheme markers, or scrap, or corpse. So if your opponent's trying to go for research mission, it makes it that much harder. And they generate resources for me. They generate cards and stones. So, hey, that's not too bad. And they've got a 2-inch melee engagement. So if I need someone to just go in and protect one of my symbol markers and just be like, you have to kill me, or you're going to be engaged and can't take down this marker, it makes them pretty useful that way.
Yep. Yeah. Like May, Zip is a dual faction master, and you did mention that you were bringing him in Bayou, but I know you also play Outcast. So what about this says Bayou Zip to you instead of Outcast Zip?
I mean, if I'm honest, I probably would prefer to run him Outcast here.
Oh, really?
Because in Outcast, I may or may not swap the smuggler for a prospector. They both have the same appraise action to eat markers to draw cards and stones, but the prospector can generate soul stones. If I need more stones coming in, I might go for a prospector. And Outcast would give me that flexibility.
Right.
It would also give me the Midnight Stalker.
Oh,
the Midnight Stalker is a model that, when I have run him, has consistently scored me at least 2 to 3 victory points per game. Because he is very durable, very fast, and can operate by himself, as a versatile model does. If I were to do Outcasts, I'd probably take him in there for sure. That would give me a crew that could really get into my opponent's side quickly and start messing with them.
Right, yeah, I mean, I know when I face the Midnight Stalker, I agonize over just leaving him alone to do his thing, but when I look at my other options, it seems like it would just always take so much to try to stop him that it seems easier, I guess, to try to play my own game than to chase down the Midnight Stalker.
Especially in a pool where you're not expecting your opponent to bring a very killy crew. And then your opponent drops Bass across the table from you and blows him off the table turn 1.
So Colgan mentioned Arcane Reservoir, off the Arcanist Upgrade Magical Training. Whether you're bringing Zip, Bayou, or Outcast, are there any upgrades that kind of, sort of scream to you?
I would say it really depends, especially with the errata to some of the Bayou upgrades. I feel like they're a lot more dependent on what I expect my opponent to bring, and would thus be a more reactive choice.
Right.
So just to briefly go over them, I would see value in putting Inferiority Complex on Zip, because I expect him to move a lot, and giving him focus for those moves. It saves him an action when he wants to shoot somebody. But I'd probably take it mostly if my opponent brings Terrifying, because Zip wants to attack because his gun is so good. 12 Cups of Coffee is another great choice on him, because it can turn off bonus actions. But if I don't want my Zip to be next to people, or my opponents have no real bonus actions I'm worried about, then I'd rather save those stones for keeping him alive. In Outcasts, well, Outcasts don't have general upgrades. I know it seems like they do, but really, their general upgrades are too niche for me.
Yeah, they're horrific.
The one I would consider is, what is it called?
Soldier for Hire?
Yes, Soldier for Hire on the Midnight Stalker, purely for the interaction between Eternal Demise Eternal and Hard to Kill.
Right.
Because now, if I expect my opponents to be able to kill him, or I need him to live because I'm going for a breakthrough, the interactions between some of the general upgrades and models can get pretty silly. So Demise Eternal says, when your model dies, you may discard a card, and if you do, you do not die, and instead you heal 4. Hard to Kill says, when this model would suffer damage and has 2 or more wounds, it may not be reduced below 1 wound. So the Midnight Stalker, he's tough to put down because he's manipulative, which means if he hasn't activated, draw negatives to target him, and he has a healthy wound pool of about 8. Your opponent has to get through manipulative to hit him. They have to do 7 plus 1 damage, which is more likely than not more than a single model's activation. Every turn, The first time he's dropped to that one last wound, I can discard a card and heal back 4. Now they have to drop me to 1 wound and then kill me again. So you have to kill him 4 times effectively before he actually dies every turn.
Right. And, as we talked about in the episode on resources, actions are one of the key resources in the game. And so the Midnight Stalker, who even without the upgrade, probably takes quite a bit of actions, or actions from a really quality model to bring down. Once you give him hard to kill, the amount of effort that you have to expend increases dramatically, or you need specific tech against those abilities. I think that analysis is spot on. So Colgan, so you've got your Mayfang crew. You see the pool in front of you. So what are some things you don't want to see on the other side of the table?
I guess anything with like easy ways to remove scrap.
Mm-hmm.
That's always going to be a concern with Mayfang, just being able to kind of tear up the network that I'm trying to build. Because outside of Walk the Rails, your crew is fairly immobile.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe like a Hoffman crew that's just like going to eat up all my scrap markers and just power themselves up probably wouldn't be great.
Right. So now, Jim, several people in our meta, as I mentioned, they're either newer or they simply prefer to play Malifaux kind of closer to 40k, in that they simply, they bring what they bring, either because it's what they own and they know, or it's just what they want to play that day. So, we do have several people who, they play either McMorning or Karis, or, some people who are going to be bringing out maybe a bit more damage than you might want to see in this kind of pool. So if you come to the table and you're going to be playing someone like a McMorning with a good amount of kill power, how is that going to affect your plan for the game?
Well, the first thing I'm going to do is figure out how they're killing, because with mobility, I dictate the terms of engagement. So if it's McMorning, for example, he has some ranged actions in his keyword through either shockwaves or projectile vomit. Side note, projectile vomit is a disgustingly good attack, and more people should be using it. Because of the sheer amount of debuffs it puts out. If they are a Karis-style crew, where there's a blend of ranged and close-range stuff, and maybe some condition removal, or some conditions going on, well, I'll know that my concealment and cover are going to be very important. Zip is handy in that a lot of his keyword gives themselves concealment, because they're, riding sputtering exhaust auras. But I would probably send my more durable pieces in on key targets and try and remove them or disable them, while the rest of my crew scores me points. So Zip is good at this because he has offensive displacement with Up We Go. He has offensive displacement and blast damage with his Zip Zapper. He has disrupting movement for pieces that can't place, like with his pianos. So if it's Karis, she can fly over it, but Elijah Borgman, if you're taking Elijah, you can drop some pianos in front of him and he can't just walk through them.
Right.
And I guess it's finding out how my opponent would be. If my opponent is going to have more offensive threat than me, how do I scalpel out his most dangerous pieces while ensuring that my schemers can still do their job?
Yeah, I could see it. So, both of you have picked crews, again, with the realization that this is a schemy pool, and you expect to have the tools you need to to get where you need to go and to drop what you need to drop. But, suppose coming to the game you realize, either from the matchup or, after, maybe a turn or a turn and a half, that you're actually the less schemy crew, for lack of a better word. At that point, do you switch to denial? I mean, how is that going to influence how you play this pool?
Yeah, I mean, I feel like just with any game, if I feel like I'm not going to be able to match my opponent's scoring, then my first thing is to look at what can I deny them? How can I force this? Which models should I be targeting? Or like what strains am I going to play to try and force a reaction on his side?
Mm-hmm.
So, as far as like Mei Fang's crew, like I feel like there are definitely a lot more schemier crews.
Right.
So again, like my biggest advantage is just the fact that I can threat multiple points at once. Having like that 12-inch move built in, like I can go back and try and deny a point if I want, or if they move away from a certain area of the board, I can jump in there and start exerting pressure there to score points and force them to react.
Right. Well, because you guys have picked, according to what you see as the crew's strengths, but kind of identifying who's the beater in the situation, right? I guess is who's the schemer in the situation. If it kind of turns out that actually the other crew has the tools that are maybe more strongly suited to the board state or the terrain, or just the way things have kind of gone. Jim, how do you look to shift gears at that point?
Oh man,
it depends.
You read my mind. But memes aside, you're either going to be the aggressor or you're going to be the reactive player, is how I look at it. You're either going to be the one forcing the conversation or answering the questions that your opponents are posing to you. If your opponent is asking you the question of, I am dropping more scheme markers than you, what do you do? Then my answer has to be, well, I have to find out where and why you're dropping the markers and disrupt it. And so I have to use the tools that I brought in for disruption purposes and prioritize actions in that disruption element. So for Zip, it means that the models with free loot, I dedicate actions to making them use free loot so that I can remove those markers. For models that are trying to get into my backfield or get engaged with my master henchman for a catch and release, it means that I have to either try and save my models that are vulnerable, like save Zip and First Mate till the later part of the turn, and then move them away and try and proactively deny that. Or if they've scored the first point and now I know what the end game is, I prioritize how to stop that end game.
Right. Sure. So a final question. Is this the kind of scenario that you would enjoy playing, or that maybe you would even prefer playing as opposed to some other options? And, if so, or even if not, why? So first, Colgan, what do you think?
So I just like this pool because I feel like there's a lot of ways you can go with it. I don't have like a strong preference for like killy or schemy. I guess like the pools I dislike are the ones where there's only like two very obvious schemes. I feel like it's less fun because the game becomes a lot more predictable. So what I like about this is that you're dropping scheme markers on the enemy side. It can be for almost anything. Like you can bluff a lot of these. You can try and force like a lot of reactions on your opponent to try and maybe prevent you from scoring these points. Like I guess send them on like wild goose chases. So I really like that element of the game when you're having to kind of like react or like predict multiple things.
Right. What about you, Jim?
Well, I mean, first off, Colgan hit the nail on the head. This is a pool where it's not immediately evident what your opponent's going for turn 2. You have 4 actions that require scheme markers to be put into the field. There are 4 schemes that require scheme markers or a multitude of markers that likely include schemes. Gotta include that research mission. On one hand, it's hard to say what they're going for. On the other hand, that scheme markers are coming, so if you can stop scheme markers, then it doesn't matter which one they picked. I kind of would prefer a split of 3-2 in the scheme pool of 3 of a kind and 2 of another kind. So what I mean by that is like 3 scheme marker schemes and then 2 schemes that might be more punchy or position based.
Right.
Like, because then if your opponent brings a crew that is just mobile but not scheme marker shenanigansy, they can drop scheme markers, and maybe they just don't care about scheme markers. Maybe they took the 2 position based schemes, but because they're so fast, they can afford to spend actions on that misdirection, because this is a game where you can use misdirection. Classic example of that, for those of you who've played with the core rules, is if Power Ritual is in the pool, you always put a scheme marker in your deployment zone corners, just in case, and to be like, I might be taking it, or maybe I spent 1 action on a turn to make you think I was taking it, and now you might try and stop me from scoring Power Ritual, and I never took it.
Right.
The fact that it's 4 scheme marker schemes and it's a interact strategy, because you have to interact with the symbol markers, that's a lot of interacts. And I feel like it really does mean that if you are one of those players who only has the Bass crew or the melee crew or a crew that's focused on doing damage rather than interacting, it makes it a lot harder for you to bring that crew and enjoy the game, because you're going to have very few outs. That's why I feel like it feels better to have a more diverse pool when it comes to the schemes. I don't know that there's a magic number there yet, but if you count them together, it just feels like if you're not taking an interact crew or a crew that can cheese interacts in some way, you're going to have a bad time.
Yeah, no, I mean, I agree. And actually, I would probably differ with you guys a little bit in that, yeah, I mean, I think this scenario definitely would produce an interesting game, and, you know, I would have fun playing it. But for me, I actually would prefer a scheme pool that, I guess you mentioned 3 and 2. I would actually prefer kind of like a 3-1 and 1 or a 2-2 and 1, you know, because I really do see the positional ones like Catch and Release as being distinct from like a Vendetta or an Assassinate. I don't see them really as belonging to the same category. And I really do prefer a game where, you know, all 3 are viable scoring options. And, you know, not just for meta reasons, not just because people in our meta do bring what they bring, or that I frequently just decide I want to play a master, and so that's what I bring to the store. But also, I think just, you know, part of what makes Malifaux interesting is the flexibility, and if you get these kinds of narrow scenarios, I think it actually eliminates a lot of the flexibility from the game, or what you're going to tend to see, at least from more experienced players. And I think that would frequently make gameplay, I mean, I don't want to say stale, but I think it does lose something at that point.
That's fair. I actually really like that, because I guess I look at the strategy and the schemes together, and like there's 6 things you can score points on.
Mm-hmm.
And like when you put it that way, if you had a killy strategy, like if instead of Symbols of Authority it was Public Enemies, and then the scheme pool was the same, that would be a far more interesting game. Right. Because suddenly your primary objective is to attack your opponent, and then all your secondaries are interact. Now you're forced to split your actions.
Or
so
play Winston.
Or play Winston. Because Winston will... It's in the name. But seriously, if... I would be more... I think having a diversity of viable win conditions is what makes Malifaux a fantastic game, because you can play a completely different game from your opponent and you both have a good time because of the way you select schemes and you build your crews. But a pool like this, where there's only one real viable way to win, which is to interact, and at that point it feels less like a faux game, if that makes sense.
Right. Well, so, you know, Jim, Colgan, thank you for your thoughts on this pool. It certainly was interesting. For those of you who listened, hope you found it entertaining, or, you know, maybe a little informative. That would be nice too. But, you know, if you liked it or if you hated it, please feel free to let us know. We play down here in Southern California, which is, you know, just one small corner of the Malifaux meta, and we would like to be a part of the larger Malifaux community, and that's part of why we're doing this podcast. So if you're out there and, you know, you play the game a different way, and you see an entirely different view of how you would do things, let us know. You know, send us that email, leave a comment. If you want to support us with a like or a comment or subscribe, all those are appreciated. We have a Patreon and a PayPal. The links are in the show notes. So if you want to help the show in that way, you know, that would be super cool of you, and we would be very appreciative of that as well. That's going to be episode 4 for us. Tune in next time for episode 5. And until then, good night, guys.
Thanks for listening.
Bye, everyone.